Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Burns. I'm the chair of the Governing Council. I hope the other members of the council here today don't mind me representing them for a few brief remarks. We're so glad you could join us for the Conference on the American Presidency here at the Miller Center. If you're online, we appreciate you tuning in. Today is truly one of those spectacular fall days here in Charlottesville. We're here at the center, which was founded in 1975, almost 50 years ago, after a difficult time in American politics with the resignation of President Nixon a year earlier and America's searing involvement in the Vietnam War crashing to a close that same year. Although the center was founded with a broad-based public policy mission, early on it focused on the American presidency. We have three priorities in our strategic plan, which will take us to our 50th anniversary 2 years from now. First, the study of the American presidency, including through our presidential oral history program and the presidential recordings efforts. Secondly, working with UVA on broad issues in democracy. And third, enabling and providing a forum for civil discourse across the political divide. While this last point may sound idealistic and almost quaint in these polarized times, we believe it is essential to keep on fighting the good fight, and I believe the staff here in the center does an outstanding job in this regard. The conference addresses all three of these strategic priorities. It builds on our deep scholarship in the presidency and the network of officials, presidency scholars, and journalists with whom we have worked over many years. And it also builds on our deep collaboration with the rest of UVA, both on the presidency and on issues of democracy. We are delighted to be a part of the Karsh Institute's Democracy 360 conference, which builds on the successful Presidential Ideas Festival we hosted in 2019. Many thanks to George and Judy Marcus and the Democracy Praxis Fund, which supported this effort, as well as to the many Governing Council members who have helped shape our discussion and in many cases are serving as panelists this week. I'm now going to hand it over to Bill Antholis, Miller Center's Director and CEO. Almost everyone here knows Bill, so I won't go into his detailed bio. But I do know that Bill would like me to thank the staff, the scholars, and the Governing Council for the enormous efforts that went into this conference. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Steve. John F. Kennedy famously once said at a White House dinner for Nobel laureates, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever been gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." And I look around the room, and I think Jefferson, when he designed UVA, would have wanted to host meetings just like this. I think he would have been humbled by the intellect, by the scope, by the diversity in so many different dimensions of people gathered here. Top talent who have managed the office of the presidency and the departments of the federal government, members of Congress who have navigated the challenge of self-governance, all of whom in this room who have worked across partisan lines. Journalists. Jefferson, as one of the leading defenders of free speech, was also witnessed withering criticism of his own presidency and his personal life. And top students of law, history, political systems who advise on the best political institutions. Indeed, Jefferson was known to pull a dozen people around a table, Federalists and Republicans alike, and have a one-table conversation on topics of importance. The presidency itself would have been a worthy topic, an office he feared, but also one that he used with power and often with principle, even occasionally, however, using powers not explicitly given to him, such as when he purchased the Louisiana Territory for a whopping $15 million. And at a moment when the country was deeply divided on domestic issues and foreign policy, he stayed committed to healing the divide between his party and the one he had defeated in a contested election whose outcome was uncertain. The idea behind this conference is rather simple. A wide range of scholars, practitioners, journalists, and other students of the presidency have come to a similar conclusion. Presidents have grown more powerful and also more prone to failure. If that's the case, how do we make the presidency more effective and also more responsible? We are all honored by the group that is assembled around that question and a series of sub-questions, and by the contribution all of you are making by joining us here. Many of you are friends of the Miller Center, but we know, more importantly, you're doing this for the good of the country and for our democracy at a time of deep polarization and global uncertainty. A word for our online audience about the format of the discussion. Each 90-minute session will be moderated, and the moderators will draw on each of the participants sitting around the table on the topics at hand. They will then turn to one another for comments and responses, including to everyone else in the room. Today, we will focus on understanding the challenges the U.S. presidency faces. We will focus on successes and failures of the presidency and the role of Congress, the courts, and the public. And then tomorrow we'll start leaning into potential reforms on how we pick our presidents, how Congress and the president work together or sometimes work in opposition, and on presidential accountability and emergency powers. As I've said now to all of our participants, everyone in this room basically agrees we need a more effective and responsible presidency. The questions before us are what to do about that and how to do that together. We hope that this is the first in a series of conversations, and we welcome guidance for how to take this forward. So now I get to introduce our moderator for our first panel on framing the problem. Bob Brunner, as we know him here, is faculty senior fellow at the Miller Center and a university emeritus professor at UVA, and he's dean emeritus of the Darden School of Business. Bob came to us after having stepped down as dean of Darden for 10 years to teach a course on the American presidency. And then he joined us in our oral history interviews of how the Bush 43 administration and the Obama administration, each separately and working together, addressed the financial crisis, which is Bob's area of expertise. He then started a project on democracy and capitalism here and is a deep student about both our political system and our economic systems. So with Bob, we hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Bill, and greetings to everyone. I see many friends in the room, familiar faces, and many new faces whom I look to make friends, and we all do. Our charge here in this first session is to explore the current day criticisms of the U.S. presidency, and we're framing this as a graduate seminar. This is not intended to be simply an expository exercise, but rather a conversation among familiar people who bring some expertise and some depth of knowledge. The University of Virginia is a research university. We're looking to open up questions and dilemmas and perhaps help frame agendas for ongoing work of us as individuals as well as places like the Miller Center. So help us all out. The critics have charged that the presidency is failing the nation on effectiveness and responsibility to its mandate from the people and from the Constitution. Some questions are, so how responsible is the presidency? How has the administrative state affected the ability of presidents to respond to needs and opportunities? What are some notable wins and some notable failures that have occurred in recent years, particularly in areas of domestic and foreign policy? What role does political polarization play in the effectiveness of the presidency? So what's working? What's not working? We'll have conversation among these 11 experts around the table who bring years of assessment of the presidency based on practical work, journalistic observation, as well as academic research. For the sake of brevity, to all of our guests and observers near and far, I won't go through a lengthy introduction of the folks around this table. Rather, I refer you to the biographical profiles given in the background material to the session. But during the discussion, I will say a few words about each individual to help you remember who they are. So here's how we'll proceed. We have a paper that motivates our discussion for this session, written by Sid Milkis, Rachel Potter. I'll turn to them first and ask them to give us an overview, sort of a morning coffee booster, a wake-up of what the ideas were that motivate this session. Then I'll turn to pairs of colleagues around the table, inviting them to respond, and particularly to questions I will loft to them. We want to be sure to hear from everyone, so I'm going to ask everyone around the table to do two things. One is, if you can, please limit your comments to 3 minutes. Much as these are complicated topics and you'll have much more to say than 3 minutes will afford, I'll ask you to sort of get to the point so that we can hear from everyone. And when you're talking, please be sure to speak into these microphones so that our wider audience observing us on live stream can hear what you have to say. Depending on the time remaining, I'll invite the group to, at large to highlight where there might be some agreement, where there is not, and where we might usefully, as a collective, begin to focus our thinking in the days, weeks, months, years to come. Without further ado, let me turn to Sid and Rachel and ask, how responsible is the presidency? What is the administrative state? How did it get there? And is the administrative state legitimate? Please.
Well, can you all hear me? Is this? Okay. I don't know if I can answer all those questions, but we try to come to terms with some of those questions in the memo we wrote. And I don't know that everybody's read it, so I'm going to try to hit the highlights of it. I have to say I'm very honored to be here, but I'm a little nervous to be facing this eminent tribunal that the Miller Center has put together. It doesn't feel very much like a graduate seminar to me. I want to start by saying I don't think you can understand the perils and the promise of presidentialism if you study the president in isolation. I see my good friend Tim Heaphy over there, so I just want to start by making an observation about the January 6th committee report. The final report of the Select Committee, which I'm sure most of you have read, is long and detailed, but it comes to a simple, startling conclusion. The central cause of January 6th was one man, former President Donald Trump, whom many others followed. None of the events of January 6th would have happened without him. There's some truth to that, but if you read the whole report, it belies, much of the evidence belies this notion that Donald Trump alone caused January 6th. It shows instead that Donald Trump's actions lit a fuse that ignited developments that had been in play for several decades. It depicts developments that shows there's been a joining of executive aggrandizement, intractable partisan gridlock, and social movement activists. The argument that Rachel and I develop is that the joining of presidential prerogative, Manichaean party politics, sometimes referred to as a cold civil war, and social activism is captured, or maybe some of you will say reified, by the concept of executive-centered partisanship. And what we mean by that is that both Democrats and Republicans depend upon presidential candidates and presidents to do many of the things that parties once did themselves. That is, to pronounce party doctrine, to raise campaign funds, to mobilize grassroots support, and to advance party programs through unilateral action and court appointments. All presidents have contributed to this development since Richard Nixon, we would say, but it reaches a dangerous culmination with Donald Trump. There are deep historical roots to this development. We point to two developments that come together by the late 1960s to bring about the development of this executive-centered partisanship. First, there are the organizational and electoral forms which weakened the decentralized, patronage-based parties that dominated most of the 19th century and lingered on pretty powerfully through the New Deal. Throughout the 20th century, both parties were pressured by insurgent movements to alter the rules governing their presidential nomination process, ostensibly to take power away from the leaders of party organizations, the gatekeepers of the presidential selection process, those who provided, as Elaine puts it in her memo, a bit of peer review to the presidential selection process. That was done so that the people, so the argument went, themselves could select presidential candidates and determine party priorities. But as it turns out, the pursuit of participatory democracy, culminating in the enactment of the McGovern-Fraser reforms in the late 60s and early 1970s, did not empower what we used to call in graduate school the Downsian median voter. Instead, the target of, which is the target of traditional more pragmatic parties, or was the target of traditional pragmatic parties. At the vanguard of these party reforms, establishing a system of direct primaries and open caucuses, were the social movements of the left and the right, first emanating from the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement that grew out of the culture wars of the 50s. So we should not be surprised that the weakening of traditional party organizations enhanced the influence of donors, interest groups, and social activists who scorn the pragmatic politics and compromises that were long honored in forging majority coalitions in the United States. We should not be surprised that these reforms curated the so-called party bases, the most militant and ideological voters who are so central to the dynamics of contemporary politics and government in the United States. This change led to a direct relationship between presidents and the party bases. And that relationship was strengthened by a second development. I know I'm probably out of time, so I'll go through this quickly and pass the baton to Rachel. The effect of these reforms has been enhanced by a second development. The culmination of an executive-centered administrative state, born of the progressive era, but consolidated or institutionalized during the New Deal. Bob asked what the administrative state is. I could take up the rest of the session trying to describe that, but let's put it in a few words. The development of the executive-centered administrative state means that executive administration, rather than laws, becomes the core activity of American government. And this becomes the prime mover of government since the 1930s. During his second and third terms, Roosevelt created the Executive Office of the President, formed in pursuance of the 1939 Executive Reorganization Act. Only a presidency nerd like me would spend as much time as I do studying the Executive Reorganization Act. I consider this statute, which only was enacted after a bitter two-year struggle in Congress, the organic statute of the modern presidency. And you know, when I was thinking about starting things off today and looking at the roster, I realized that many of the distinguished participants in this conference have served in positions that did not exist before the enactment of the 1939 Reorganization Act. So I hope you won't be offended when I conclude with the following. With the Executive Office of the President, comprised of the White House office and important staff agencies like the Office of Management and Budget, the White House was able to form alliances with activists and outside groups who viewed the modern executive as the sword choking up as I say this, as a sword that could advance their causes by cutting through the Gordian knot of the complex system of checks and balances established by the Constitution, and that knot becomes particularly problematic when it's ensnared by partisan gridlock. So I know I didn't keep to my 3 minutes, but that's my
Yes, this is a distillation of an extraordinarily good book by Nicholas Jacobs and Sid Milkus. It's just come out, and he has managed to say in a little over 6 minutes what...
Sorry, Rachel. That's what we call a filibuster, right?
What Jacobs and Milkus took nearly 400 pages to say. So good for you. Rachel?
Good morning. I want to reiterate Sid's thanks to the Miller Center for convening a really diverse group of talent in this room and raw intellectual firepower. So I am really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have over the next 2 days. So Sid did a great job of laying out the historical factors that gave rise to the president becoming the focal point of the party, a phenomenon we refer to as executive-centered partisanship. The problem with this development in the presidency is that it coincides with another development in American politics, and that is the rise of heightened partisan polarization, particularly among elites. Political scientists have done an excellent job documenting the rise of partisan polarization in Congress, and also in the broader public, and we refer to that as affective polarization, the negative feelings that people have about the other party that are growing today, particularly among people who are deeply involved in politics. The consequences of extreme partisan polarization reverberate through each of the essays that were commissioned today. That was striking to me in reading them. So we think there are two developments in particular that apply to the presidency that are worth thinking about as a group and talking about. First, as many, many people have noted, partisan gridlock shifts the locus of policymaking from the legislative branch to the executive branch. This incentivizes the president to use unilateral executive actions as a way to accomplish their political agenda. It's hard to get a partisan Congress to pay attention to a president's goals and to use their legislative powers to accomplish the president's goals. This is particularly exacerbated in a period of where divided government has become the norm. The result is that unilateral actions are used frequently in the contemporary presidency, and they're frequently used in ways that we think are particularly partisan. So in our essay, we provide two examples, or several examples, but let me point to two really quickly. First is Donald Trump's use of executive orders and presidential proclamations to accomplish immigration goals that were explicitly part of his Republican Party agenda. And Barack Obama, on the other side, using executive actions and presidential memoranda to establish a DACA program, which was in line with his Democratic presidential agenda. There are many more instances we could point to. I'm sure many of you have them in your head right now. The second development that the collision of executive-centered partisanship and partisan polarization bring is the refashioning of the bureaucracy in ways that suit presidential partisan goals. So we see this in numerous ways. Again, we can talk about all of the tactics if that's of interest to this group, but I'll just point to two really quickly. First is appointments. So we see appointees that are selected very often on the basis of loyalty to the president rather than competence for the job for which they are asked to perform. I also point to the rise of the unitary executive theory, a pet project of the conservative right, and a move that encourages presidents to take stronger control of the bureaucracy and encourages them perhaps to use that bureaucracy in partisan ways. Here we point in the essay to President Trump's Schedule F executive order, which would change the composition of the bureaucracy perhaps in very partisan ways. So the genie is out of the bottle. We cannot separate the president from the party. We cannot, in this room, fix partisan polarization, I don't think. So what can we do? We can talk about how to develop a more perfect presidency in light of these two developments. So how can we structure a more perfect presidency in light of executive-centered partisanship and heightened partisan polarization? So I'll throw that to you. The rest of the panel can solve that. Thanks.
Okay, let's turn from academia to practice. Josh Bolton and Tom Donnellan, you both served at the most senior levels of staff in the White House. Josh is President George W. Bush's chief of staff, and Tom is Obama's security advisor. So give us the inside view. How effective is the presidency? Has it been from your points of view?
We'll go in chronological order. Not our ages, Josh.
All right. Bob, thank you. Bill, thank you for convening us for what I think is a terrific conversation. I come as a student rather than a teacher to this subject, but I think it seems to me it's one that of which we should all be students, because we face such an enormous threat in our country today from political polarization. And I think Rachel is right that executive-centered partisanship is a major contributor to that. It is by no means the only contributor. And I happen to be of the view that that we are suffering from extreme political polarization because people have become polarized, and that's not something we're going to be able to solve with tinkering with the institutions of our government, but it is something that we can ameliorate, and something very important that we can ameliorate. Those of us who are engaged in pulling the levers of government, but I think we have to approach that with some humility about the depth of the problem that we're actually facing in this country today. Those of us who have served in the White House before, during the term of our service, none of us believed that the presidency was insufficiently empowered. All of us at one point or another had felt something that I realized could be best described as parliament envy, in which we wondered, why is it not possible for there to be a unitary government? Other democracies manage this, in which the leader of the country can actually control the levers of government. Now, in the parliamentary democracies, of course, have the additional feature of much more flexibility, and that when the people lose confidence in their governance, they can throw the bastards out with greater ease than we can. So we've made a trade-off in our governance, and I don't think it's the remit of this group to move us that way. And in fact, we probably don't want to move that way. I am a believer in one of the fundamental theses of the work that Sid and Rachel presented to us, and that is that the executive-centered system that we have evolved into is actually a contributor to our problems in both governance and in social cohesion. There is such a thing as the deep state. Most of us probably were grateful for it during the Trump years, because we believe that there were patriots in the deep state who prevented President Trump from acting on his, using the extraordinary powers that have accrued in the presidency, that there were elements of the deep state that prevented President Trump from acting on some of those worst instincts. But it's not a good thing to have a deep state, and it is not a good thing to have as extensive an administrative state as we have, that can be directed in ways that cause us to flip back and forth based on very slim electoral majorities to flip wildly back and forth between the political aims of one party and another. I think there are ways to rein in that administrative state, and I think some of them, by the way, go speak to structural issues like the so-called quasi-independent agencies, whose powers and authorities the president is able to unleash and then pretend that he has no control over them. But there are many different elements of that I think we need to address as we consider this question, because it seems to me what our object ought to be in this exercise is to maneuver our institutions of government into a position where compromise becomes not only possible but necessary, and that if we can maneuver ourselves toward in that direction, which does involve reducing the fundamental authorities of the president, or at least involves cabining them so that there is some consensus, some center consensus required before major government changes are made, then we will all be greatly advantaged in that. Bob, I don't know how much of my 3 minutes is left.
You're up, but if you would,
I will make.
If you would please draw to a conclusion.
I'll dig into some of Tom's time, given my seniority over him. And I'll just make one other comment, which is that both parties have driven us toward that executive-centered partisanship, but for different reasons. Both parties have political reasons to do that. Democrats have also tended to do it for policy reasons, and Republicans, especially during the Trump era, have tended to do it for personality reasons, for an unhealthy instinct toward authoritarianism. I happen to think both parties are wrong on those counts, and that's one of the issues I think we ought to address.
Hold that thought. Tom, Donald?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I'm going to offer some more specifics rather than kind of a general thing. Although the presidency certainly operates in a much more polarized environment than it ever has, right? Maybe since the Civil War. And indeed, I hope, Bill, we get a chance to hear from Larry Sabato on the poll that was just put out from the Center on Politics, right? Which is an extraordinary poll, demonstrating the deepness of the depth of the polarization, but also the views that Americans have towards their fellow Americans, right, with respect to their being dangerous to the future of the country, and even contemplating the proposition that violence is appropriate in some cases in order to prevent the other side from achieving their goals. And it'd be useful, I think, to hear that. But so presidents certainly operate in a much deeper polarized environment than they have, I think, probably since the Civil War. And my personal experience goes back. I'm looking around the room. I think the only person who was with me at the time, starting with President Carter in the 1970s, was my dear friend Elaine. But since that time, I certainly have seen this kind of develop as a context for presidents operating. Point one. Point two, I'd like to just offer just a quick reflection, though, on the effectiveness of the president in the national security area and in foreign policy. I don't really think, and again, I think it's an appropriate reflection at this point, by the way, because in fact, since 2001, right, when the United States was perhaps the most powerful nation that the world had seen in a very long time, we've now kind of gone on a journey to a point where I think that the United States faces its most difficult and fraught international environment since World War II. Which Philip and I have been talking about a lot over the last little bit here. So it is worth reflecting on this. Now, I don't think, though, there's a matter of structural issues or deficiencies in the presidency, frankly, with respect to the kind of performance over time. I don't think that. I think that, and indeed, I think that the powers of the presidency are basically adequate to the task, frankly, in foreign policy and national security. I'll talk about executive arrangements and executive orders in just a second. as I said, it is constrained in some respects. You know, the ability to get formal treaties through the Congress has been constrained, I think, because of polarization, but also ideological views towards treaties and issues of sovereignty. But it's not been impossible. It's not been impossible. During the Obama administration did the New START treaty, an arms control treaty with the Russians, right? During the Trump administration, we did the United States, Canada, and Mexico Free Trade Agreement. Even the Iranian agreement, right? The Iranian nuclear agreement was subject to a review mechanism in the Congress at the end of the day. So it is difficult. It's not impossible, I think, to work through these things in Congress. And indeed, you know, Bob, you know that at the outset of the financial crises, right, and the pandemic, there was bipartisan work done at the beginning of these crises. So it's not impossible. And it's not unconstrained, I think, on the president's side. I do think, Sid and Rachel, I do think you kind of underestimated a bit the constraints that are on the presidency in the foreign policy area of public opinion, of the courts, and of the Congress, particularly given the appropriations power in the Congress. So what has been the issue, I think, with respect to performance over the last, you know, the period that I'm, you know, most familiar with, I think it's been twofold. I think if you go back and look at each of the instances, right, where there has been a failure on the national security foreign policy side, it has its roots in two things. One, failed process, and the kind of the organization, not in a conscious, purposeful way, dealing with the problems in front of it, which had resulted in poor inputs, ill-timed decisions, not fully informed decisions, or not following the process at all. And the other piece of it is on the personnel side, frankly, and putting in place, you know, selections of individuals as opposed to teams. So there are a couple of practice points here, I think, if you look at each of the instances, we can go through them all, and, you know, you can have, there are positive examples. I think the bin Laden takedown was a positive example of 7 months of process, right? There have been failures on the process side. I think the Iraq War lead-up was a failed process story in large extent, also a team issue, I think. So I don't think it's a structural issue. I think if you actually go back and look at the specific instances. Now, to date, with respect to national security, in the modern era, we have actually had people elected to the presidency who have been, in the main, responsible and sophisticated people with respect to foreign policy. We had a different kind of president elected in 2016, and the question I think presented for the group is what that means for the future, right? I think that was, you know, that was a result of a lot of the trends that Josh talked about, you know, degradation of the parties, you know, kind of unlimited money from special interests, a deep sense of failure among the American people and what the government's been able to deliver to address their concerns over time. And so the question then is whether or not we're going to a new phase, right? We've actually, if you know, kind of take it from the end of World War II to today, take it from, I think from the, you know, from Roosevelt now, we actually, with respect to foreign policy, have had responsible, sophisticated people. Are these trends, though, in the system going to result in different kinds of presidents going forward? We've been fairly lucky so far with respect to our selection of presidents. Two closing quick things, right? Personnel. Valerie Boyd's paper, I think, is excellent and important with respect to personnel, and we can do something about this. When I say personnel, I mean the delay in the confirmation process, an entire departments and agencies not being led, right, during, you know, for extended periods of time. This is a moment to deal with that, I think. You know, it's an even-up election in 2024. And the moment to discuss reducing the number of appointees, trying to come up with agreements on process in terms of timing, but also to discuss, I think, the principle of maybe we should go back to the point where the president actually gets his appointments if they're fit, right? And the name, and try to come, because we don't know who's going to win the presidency in 2024. Maybe there's a way here to do this. The point, by the way, and I'll close on this on personnel, that you made about, I think, Rachel, you made loyalty over confidence with respect to appointments. So I've done 4 national security transitions. 3 won, 1 didn't win, right, 2016. And I don't think that's right. And I'd be glad to sit down and go through a matrix with you of people, right, with respect to what they brought to the table and whether it was loyalty versus competence or experience and whether it wasn't. I think that'd be a useful exercise to do because I don't think you're right. Okay. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much.
So one's ever said that.
Thank you, Tom, on behalf of all the loyal political appointees here.
I said, no,
You all wouldn't say that's the case in everything. In national security, it's a
I'm talking
special
about the
case.
national,
Yeah.
that's what I was going to say.
Well, you
to
wouldn't
Josh,
say
yeah.
that in commerce and in lots of other areas.
Yeah, I'm not talking. Yeah, well, yeah, I'm talking about my people, Josh. Right? In the national security area, in the, you know.
Okay, let's turn to security, both domestic and international. Philip Zelikow and Elaine Kamark, you served on White House staffs. Philip for the Bush 43 and Elaine for the Clinton administrations. You've written on the presidential selection process and on crises and policy failures. Does the way we elect presidents affect their performance in office and their ability to respond to crises or failing policies?
Well, my answer to that is yes. That when we moved from a semi-public system to a totally public system of primaries, we moved from a system that had some element of peer review in it to a system where it was basically a popularity contest. And I'll give you a little thought experiment. So imagine, way back in 1960, 59, Jack Kennedy had to go in and sit down with Governor Lawrence of Pennsylvania, who controlled a great big block of delegates. And they obviously probably had cigars and whiskey, and they talked about, politics. Could Jack win? He was a Catholic. But they also probably talked about some governing things. And it was probably a pretty wide-ranging discussion where Governor Lawrence, who eventually did throw his delegates to Kennedy, could take stock of this young whippersnapper and see if he was okay. Imagine now Donald Trump in that old-fashioned system, sitting down with the equivalent of Governor Lawrence and saying to him, I'm going to build a wall. Governor Lawrence might say, okay, maybe that'll work. And I'm going to make Mexico pay for it. Maybe one of the dumbest statements a presidential candidate has ever made, right? And you can see that there was an element to the Trump campaign that just wasn't getting there. Going back to foreign policy for a minute, do you all remember the debate where they asked Donald Trump a question about the nuclear triad? The guy was lost. Now, I've been a college professor for a long time, so as many of you in the room, we're very good at figuring out when somebody doesn't know the answer, when they didn't do the reading, right? And he clearly had no earthly idea what they were talking about. So there is this problem with the system we have, which is this absence of even a minimal, body of knowledge or experience for doing the job. What that does is it leads to then a White House situation that is as follows. The White House, I think, Sid, you described the White House staffing pretty well, only you left out one important piece of it. White House, the power in modern White Houses is in the communications people. It's all about what's the message, It used to be the 24-hour news cycle, now it's the 15-minute news cycle. What's the message? There is little attention, or even people don't even want to know about governance. And what you have now is a distance between the White House and the executive branch of the government. Now, the executive branch of the government is about 2 million people, more or less, and because it's so big, at each point in time, something's going very right and something's going very wrong. And inevitably, the White House staff misses both of those. Okay, they miss the progress, they miss the failures. And they don't even know enough to see the failures. Why? Because those are out there. Tom's right, and even on the domestic side, a lot of times the people put in the executive branch agencies are in fact quite competent and able to manage those agencies. What they don't have is they have no access to the White House.
Elaine, I got 1 more minute.
Okay, and I'll end with another story. Bob Reich, in the book he wrote right after he left the Clinton administration, described the following situation. He said the White House was like a king and his courtiers, and the cabinet secretaries were like the governors of far-flung provinces that had to come and get attention. And I think that's mismatch that is causing government failure all across the board.
Yeah, just a slight correction, Bob. I did not work in the White House in the Bush 43 administration. I worked in the White House in the Bush 41 administration.
Thank you.
I worked in the State Department in the Bush 43 administration. But the question that you asked was about, is the way we select presidents responsible for the problems we have in presidential performance? And I think mainly the answer is no. And we need to be careful not to overgeneralize from Trump. So it's very useful then, the fundamental problem is that expectations of governance have skyrocketed over the last 40 to 60 years. And the performance of governance in relation to those expectations seems dramatically low. And public trust in governance has collapsed. I co-authored a book 26 years ago when I was teaching at Harvard called Why People Don't Trust Government, that actually came to a lot of these conclusions when we published in 1997. So when people then think about the failures of performance, I think it's really useful to separate two definitions of policy. Let's call this fictive policy and factual policy. Most people inhabit the world of fictive policy. This is the world of imagined government power. It is the world in which government officials take positions, adopt postures, and strike poses, and they are hired to take positions, strike postures, adopt poses of toughness, generosity, etc. And it's a world of paper policy. That's the world of fictive policy, the imaginarium of what government does, the abstractions that many people inhabit and inflame them when governance really then just becomes an aspect of the culture war. Then there's another world of governance, which is the factual world of policy. In the world of factual policy, this is where you actually try to do things that happen in the world. When you think about the crushing failures of performance, though, they mostly have to do with with problems with doing things in the world, with the world of factual policy. In the world of factual policy, the fundamental problem actually has been the general decline of policy competence in executive governance. Competence can be defined simply as a mix of capabilities and know-how. So take, for example, to be very concrete about it, what are the two most crushing failures of the last 5 years that every single American has heard of? One, COVID crisis. Two, Afghanistan. Are either of those related to the way we selected the president? In both cases, the answer is no, not decisively. I led a large group that studied the COVID crisis and published its report, Lessons from the COVID War, in April. Our group concluded unanimously that, as we put it, Trump was a comorbidity. We all remember what a comorbidity is. It's a pre-existing condition that increases your risk of death or serious illness. So that's a factor. But when you actually then really work through the nuts and bolts of what happened in the crisis, the Trump factor fades into that background environment, which is important but not decisive. One thing to note, that despite the executive-centered partisanship argument, Congress was not at all paralyzed during the crisis. Congress moved $5 trillion in discretionary fiscal policy in the crisis and instantly did whatever was asked of it. The problems actually mostly the design of what Congress was asked to do, because a lot of that money was ineffectual, and the policy response was generally weak. If you even examine where the policy response was strong, like the the actual story of the warp speed program, which we go into in some detail. Trump, by the way, had almost nothing to do with the origin of warp speed or its progress one way or another. He grudgingly agreed to it, grousing about how much it cost when Jared Kushner presented it to him. It wasn't Kushner's idea either. It had come from a really odd collection of insiders and outsiders who then persuaded an HHS secretary who was hanged to his job by a thread and was desperate to have something to say, to pitch this to Kushner, who then saw it as a possible palliative as everything else was going disastrously. And then the program was kind of protected from the chaos that beset everything else in the Trump administration, partly by Kushner and partly by the Secretary of Defense, Mike Esper, and JCS Chairman Mark Milley. So,
Philip, one more minute, please.
If you then take the Afghanistan case, again, it's whatever your theory is for failure of Afghanistan, probably executive-centered partisanship is not going to be at the core of those theories. Wherever you put the key crossroads, even down to the failures that occurred in the first year of the Biden administration in 2021, I don't think that's really the answer. So the bottom line for this is, for me, is in a time of high crisis, we need to dramatically refocus our attention on the factual world of policy and on the general decline of the competence that's needed when the demands on governance so dramatically exceed the effective supply.
Thank you very much. Francis Townsend and Eric Edelman, you were both distinguished civil servants as well as senior political appointees in domestic security, Francis, or international security, Eric. You've seen the White House respond to security crises. How effective and responsible is the presidency in light of your experiences?
I'll start, Fran, if you don't mind. Well, first I have to start, Bob, by thanking you for chairing this panel and Bill for inviting me. It's humbling to actually be sitting here amidst a group of people I've learned a lot from and a bunch of former colleagues in government. So let me start with a confession. I am a creature of the deep state. I'm 30 years, 30 years as a career civil servant working in this area. And so my views on this are heavily inflected, and particularly by my experience working in the White House with Josh Bolten on 9/11 when the United States was attacked, and watching what transpired afterwards. And there's a lot we can debate, and Tom has already opened up some of those issues about the response of the Bush administration. But I think there's one incontrovertible fact, which is the president's overriding strategic objective in the wake of 9/11 was that the United States not be subject to another mass casualty attack by terrorists, and we have not had one in 22 years. Had you been a betting man on the morning of September 12th, 2001, you might not have laid heavy odds on that. Second point I would make is that I agree largely with Josh and Tom that the President and the presidency certainly have enough power to execute effectively and credibly in national security affairs as, from the constitutional point of view. I would say, however, that there is a question in my mind about the mechanism by which the president executes that, which is largely the National Security Act of 1947, is still fit for purpose in the current environment that we face. In 1966, Henry Kissinger wrote an article in Daedalus called Domestic Structure and Foreign Policy. Philip, I think, knows that article well. It bears reading even almost 60 years later, because it talks about the difficulty that any president has in imposing his or her vision of foreign policy, if they actually have one, when they're elected, on the large government bureaucracy that exists for the execution of national security policy. That was written in a period when the government and the administrative state was actually much smaller than it is today, and with many fewer elements that have international elements to it than exist today.
Eric, 1 minute.
And the question in my mind, Mara Rudman and I are currently serving on a commission appointed by Congress to review the national security or national defense strategy that the Biden administration articulated. Is in a world where we're facing a competitor that has civil-military fusion, do we have the instruments to have not just a whole-of-government approach in national security, but a whole-of-society approach, which is going to be necessary for the kind of competition we have?
Fran?
So first, thank you, Bill, for having me. I too am very humbled, and I too must confess I was a member of the deep state for almost 25 years before serving in the White House. Let me pick up on some of the threads because that I think that Josh and Tom and Eric have now pointed to. I do think the president has the authorities, the necessary authorities he needs to respond to a national security or foreign policy crisis. Look, I came to the White House and was given that mission to make sure that there was never another mass casualty event, and everybody was betting against the possibility of preventing it. Here's what we didn't have to deal with, which is a differentiator. The poll that Tom referred to, that the University of Virginia released this week, says that 41% of Biden supporters and 38% of Trump supporters believe it is acceptable to use violence in this country to stop the other party from achieving their goals. We did not have to deal with that in a post-9/11 world. And that's a critical difference. We didn't have agreement on immigration. We desperately tried to get immigration reform done. Josh and I bear the scars of that effort. So there was not uniform agreement on many issues. But there wasn't that level of animus in the country that we had to deal with. When you talk about, Josh mentioned the deep state, I think there's good news and bad news here. You, Rachel, mentioned the Schedule F order of President Trump. The way that the president exerts his rightful elected authority on the deep state is through what's called the Schedule C appointments. That is right. Most don't have to be confirmed. And it's a quick way for the president to begin to rein in this, sprawling bureaucracy. Those people, I served in the Justice Department and the national security roles. Those Schedule C appointments, I served in both Democratic and Republican administrations, are chosen on competence alone. Those are not people who were knocking on doors. Those are people who had deep either academic or policy experience in those areas. And the career civil service looked to those people for policy guidance. They didn't fight them. Yes, when new administrations come in, there is a sense of, establishing relationships of trust with those people. But it's very important that the president is able to assert his elected authority over the bureaucracy. I will say that in terms of the deep state, I think we've seen the civil service make real mistakes. We've seen the abuse of, I ran in the Justice Department, what is now the Justice Department's National Security Division, which was responsible for FISA wiretaps. We've seen the FBI abuse that authority. We've seen those sorts of mistakes, and when that trust is lost, it's very difficult for the institutions to regain it. Not only that, when politicians then sort of leverage those mistakes to demean the institutions, we find now that it's gone down to the individual level. Civil servants in their communities
1 minute.
are now undermined as individuals, not just those institutions. So I think we have to look at, if you want to make the president more effective in the implementation of his policies, you've got to look for ways to strengthen the civil service. I'll leave you with one thought. It was something I advocated unsuccessfully when I was still in government. Just as the military has a joint force, a purple capability where people serve across different services. We've never developed that in the civil service, where you're required as you ascend in the civil service to have purple joint experience. I think it's absent that. I think it's impossible to build a Fran or an Eric or a Bill or Nick Burns or a Dennis Ross today. I think you have to institutionalize the idea that we're going to have people capable of working across the interagency and promote them so that when a new president comes in, he has a cadre to rely on, much like the UK does it.
Very good. Thank you, Fran. So Mark Silverstone, Katie Tenpass, you're scholars of the government, of the presidency. Mark, you're the general editor of the Miller Center's presidential recordings, and after listening to endless hours on tape, you have some insights into how the sausage of presidential policy is made. Katie, your scholarship is focused on presidential transitions and staffing. Based on your work, how responsible and effective is the presidency?
I'm a member of the home team, so I'm happy to bat last. Sure. So going back to those tapes and thinking about some of those key moments and reflecting on what appears in several of the papers, which cites the 1960s as the moment when we get that really supercharged activist White House. Kennedy himself saying in the 1960 campaign that the presidency is the vital center of the whole scheme of government. It is the executive that was really at the forefront of some of the most important developments during that decade that we listened to and catalog, and none was bigger than the Vietnam War. And if you look at the emergence of that war as a process, beginning most dramatically with Kennedy, when he entered office with less than 700 U.S. military advisors in the field, and on November 22nd, 63, there were close to 17,000 U.S. military advisors. That development took place with virtually no input from Congress as well. That was entirely a Kennedy operation through the National Security Council, but also heavily influenced by the Pentagon and to some extent the State Department as well. That dynamic continued into the Johnson presidency, most famously through the Tonkin Gulf episode of August of 1964, when Congress played its role, but really in a very perfunctory way, given the few hours that it spent debating the Tonkin Gulf resolution and then passing it virtually unanimously, giving the president carte blanche to wage war, to defend American interests as he saw it. Now, when Johnson, the following summer in July of actually just before that, in May of 1965, when he is requesting further funds for American forces, which had grown considerably by that time in Vietnam, but also funds for those Marines in the Dominican Republic, Johnson is considering the virtues of going back to Congress, recognizing that he perhaps is about to do something more significant, and pondering the virtues of seeking congressional input on that, and he chooses not to. And he does so even in the face of recognizing that the Tonkin Gulf resolution is insufficient for what he proposes militarily. And we know that because we have Johnson on tape saying that directly to Bob McNamara. And the failure to involve Congress to such an extent contributes to the perceived failure of the policy, illegitimacy of the policy, the responsibility and effectiveness of the president at that time. And it is a signal moment, I think, that we need to consider as we then march forward through history and think about later episodes in American foreign relations when Congress did play a larger role. 1991, as President George H.W. Bush is considering war in the Persian Gulf. Congress certainly plays a role. It's effective. It contributes to the legitimacy, the bipartisan legitimacy, even though it was a close vote. But the sustainability of the policy, and as many have suggested around this table, the need for that sense of sustainability and legitimacy is paramount. In 2001, 2002 following 9/11, the 2001 AUMF authorization for the use of military force, and then in 2002, the Iraq resolution. Congress also plays its role, but in time, and I would second the notion that it is very effective in doing so, and the ability to prevent another mass casualty event is a signal achievement. But as both of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq lose favor among the American public, and with Congress's reluctance through not just the Bush but into the Obama administration to revisit the AUMFs, particularly with them still on the books, and the 2002 with Iraq, with its commitment to support the Iraq state, and who knows what might happen, what developments might take place in the Middle East, through which a president might use that AMF to deploy forces again in that region. I think it's critical that Congress reassert itself, particularly for the purpose of sustaining the legitimacy of the policy through the country at large.
Okay, thank you. I also want to, I am honored to be at the table, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. And thanks to Sid and Rachel for their thoughtful article. I think it was thought-provoking. And so when we think about presidential failures and what can be done, I just want to make 2 points that haven't been made. And one is that you cannot think of the presidency in a vacuum. You need to look at Congress. And since the 1970s, Congress has essentially abdicated many of its responsibilities as they relate to lawmaking. The quest for re-election overwhelms members of Congress. And so many times their decisions are not made for policy purposes, but they're made for politics. And so when you think about the presidency, if one institution is not upholding its constitutional role, it really has a huge impact. And so there's a reason, I think, that presidents have aggrandized authority and powers over time, and maybe at moments over-exercise those powers. So that's one point, is just not to think of the presidency in a vacuum and to think about how we can prevent future failures. The second has to do with a point that Josh made earlier, which is the multifactorial nature of this. Like, there's no single reason why we have failures. And in fact, I would point to what I consider to be a very important exogenous factor for the presidency, and that is the quest for re-election. Presidents on day one are thinking about how they can get reelected 4 years later. And so much of what they do is seen through this lens of the quest for reelection. And I'm not advocating a single 6-year term or any sort of major changes, but I think that we need to understand that these are fundamentally political actors. And they often want to do what is in their best interests, as opposed to advancing and maybe making it so that those that they appoint across the government are more competent than they are loyal, or they don't always have the best interests of our country and our republic at the forefront because they are political actors. And so I just wanted to make those 2 points, that I think it's important to think about how exogenous factors are affecting presidential failures, as well as opposed to thinking of the institution on its own.
Okay,
and I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
John Dickerson, you're our wind-up batter here. You've interviewed and reported upon many of the recent presidential administrations. In your recent book, you called the presidency, quote, the hardest job in the world, unquote. Why is it so hard, and does the hardness of the job impair the effectiveness of the presidency?
President Biden's probably feeling like it's a pretty hard job this week. And thank you, everyone, and to everybody at this table. I'm pretty sure I've either interviewed or relied on the work of everybody at this table, which is incredibly humbling. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the role that I play in this, which is involved in the public discourse and covering campaigns. But I'm really grateful. I also have a page full of scribbles responding to lots of things, but let me stick to what I originally was going to say, which was, of course, it's always been hard. The obligatory Jefferson quote at the beginning of this, because of where we are, who complained about the difficulty of the presidency, said, "It is not because I do less than I might do, but that I have more than I can do." Sid mentioned the Executive Reorganization Act, where people took trains to Washington to protest what FDR was trying to do by asking for just a little bit of help. As the Brownlow Commission said, the presidency needs help. It was trying to catch up with the pace of modernity. FDR, who expanded the office of the presidency, we all know that. He could fit himself, his vice president, and his cabinet behind his desk. There were just 10 of them. There are 25 cabinet rank people in the Biden White House. It requires a special lens to capture them all in the same picture. The presidency, in terms of the way I deal with it mostly, which is about the myths and the expectations of the presidency, with each success of a president since FDR has accrued a new responsibility. So you have to be able to tame the economy like FDR did. You have to be able to comfort the country like Reagan did after the Challenger disaster. And you have to whip Congress into shape the way Johnson did. Those are the expectations every president has to deal with. And my remarks are pretty much about how those expectations are totally out of whack. But just in terms of the growth of the job, there's a period from the Obama presidency that strikes me, which is the single, probably alone moment of the presidency is that bin Laden raid that Tom mentioned. In the run-up to the bin Laden raid, Obama was chairing the national security meetings. These are the other things he had to contend with at that very short and important and high-stakes period of time. He had to give an education policy speech. He had meetings with the leaders of Denmark, Brazil, Panama, meetings to avert a government shutdown. He held fundraising dinners, gave a budget speech, attended a prayer breakfast, held immigration reform meetings, announced a new national security team, planned for his re-election, and launched a military intervention in Libya. The day before he made this decision, the go decision, the White House had to release his long-form birth certificate raised by the man who would then become his successor. The night before the raid, he had to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner and give a speech. So that gives you some sense of the colliding kind of symbolic and serious madness of the job. And as that's happened, we as Katie was saying, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. The Congress could take some of the things off of a presidential plate if it was functioning. It doesn't address those issues, and the ability of a president to work with Congress with narrow margins. Francis Lee has written so well about this, narrow margins where the partisanship is so high, where Pew's been sorting these questions since 1994. The number of people who, and Fran mentioned this, or a version of this, the number of people who think the other side is evil, not just wrong. You know, Reagan used to say it's not they're bad people, it's just their policies are wrong. Now, actually, both parties think the other party is evil, which creates a condition where it's very hard for a president to work with Congress. Public perception about the presidency, of course, has dropped. I could spend a day talking about White House team building, but I don't have the expertise in that, because that's one of the things in all my reporting that was so interesting to me. So I'm going to talk about this mismatch in expectations, which I think is important because it leads to a couple of things. What Phil's talking about, which is this disconnect between the fictive and factual presidency, and also the danger that Fran raised, which is that if people have mismatches between their expectations of the presidency and what actually happens in it, they say there must be some evil force at play, and therefore we must take up arms to fix the situation because something is thwarting this otherwise job that can be done relatively easily. Where does that expectation first get its, this errant expectation, where does it first come into play? It comes into play in campaigns, where candidates say they can slay any problem through just the sheer force of their will. Donald Trump, who, and we all, of course, have said and recognized the fact that he is a special case, but he's also kind of proof of a lot of these trends, who said, I alone can fix it, was, of course, the furthest extent of this. What that does is it embeds an expectation in the public that the political scientist Brendan Nyan calls the Green Lantern effect. The Green Lantern is a cartoon character, is a comic book character who is powerful merely by the assertion of his will. The more willpower he asserts, the more powerful he is. That is the expectation of a presidency. If something isn't happening, it's not because life is complex, it's not because Congress isn't working, it's not because you can't move, you can't make 15-minute brownies in 3 minutes. It's that it's sheerly a lack of willpower on the part of the president. And so if you have that expectation, then throw the bomb out or do something to, take violent action in response. And of course, the Green Lantern effect does three things. First of all, it locates all the powers in the presidency. We run our campaigns where the president says, I can do all these things, and everybody naturally turns to the president and says, why aren't you doing all these things? The second thing it does is it flattens everything. Complexity is completely reduced on complicated issues like the economy. And finally, it misses the truth, which is sometimes, and those of you in the foreign policy realm know this well, sometimes restraint Not acting is the best thing a president can do, not in the way we set the presidency up in our presidential campaigns. The second mismatch is between history and reality. How many times have you heard the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan story? Well, the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan story is they got together, they worked out a deal on Social Security, it was great, why can't presidents do that now? Ronald Reagan had 144 Democrats who were elected in districts that he won. What did that mean? That meant those Democrats in the House had to work with Reagan's ideas and policies because they had voters in their district who liked Ronald Reagan. There were only
1 minute.
There are only 14 minutes. We have to go to a commercial break. That's the only language I know, Bob. 144 Democrats in districts that Reagan won. There are only 14 Republicans in districts that Biden won. There are also lots of other partisan reasons, but that explains one reason why these mismatches between what we think of as a historical norm for the office and what reality is. The next point, which might be the final point since I have so little time, is the streetlight effect. We all know the story of the streetlight effect. The policeman comes upon the drunk looking for his keys under the light, and he says, "Oh, did you drop them here?" And the drunk says, "No, but the light is better." This is the way we tend to cover presidencies, and this happened after the Hamas attack. There was a pretty long, relative to today's news cycle, pretty long news cycle in partisan press saying Joe Biden only has 2 items on his presidential agenda, as if the presidency is determined by what's on the presidential agenda. Fox News reported there was a lid called at the White House at 11:45, as if what you see the president do is what the president does. Matt Gaetz once said, if you aren't making news, you aren't governing. Now, nobody would quote Matt Gaetz as an authority on anything, but he is the world's foremost authority on not governing at the moment. So you would say, oh, well, this is just partisans. But Politico ran a piece this week saying how the attack by Hamas was a challenge to Biden's version of the presidency. And it went and gave the White House point of view, which is that his experience would give him a kind of fingertip feel for dealing with the world. But then it rebutted that by saying, but for the second straight day, Biden also stayed entirely out of the public eye, as if being in the public eye were the way to deal with this challenge. That's not to say that there isn't a public component, but to define it totally by that is wrong. So, in conclusion, I should say one other thing. Jeff Zients, when I interviewed him for the book, said, we have signing ceremonies where everybody gets a pen. Why don't we have execution of policy ceremonies? It's just another way in which what we see is mismatched with the job itself. And the final point of all this is because in my business, we are obsessed with polls. And this goes back to the discussion we've talked about, the rise of primaries, the rise of the base, the way in which the presidents and the Daily Message run a White House. That's because all we do is go around and say, what's the president's approval rating? It's this constant thermometer temperature taking of the public mood because we cover the presidency not by what happens, but by what the public thinks about what happens. If Peter Drucker is right and what gets measured is what matters, if what gets measured is what gets managed, then the fact that we're measuring all of these mismatched points of view is what ends up getting managed. And if you're judging, which essentially is like judging the quality of a painting by taking the blood pressure of the artist, it is totally disconnected with the job that we're all here to talk about. And that leads to a misdirection of focus, misunderstanding the actions that are truly valuable to the objective, and it leads to a mismanaging of resources and efforts. And so we've got to get things back in line.
Thank you, John, so much. Customarily, in graduate seminars, we let the authors of the motivating papers rebut and extend. I give you all 3 minutes to.
Okay.
You go first, Rachel.
Okay. Well, wow, this is a lot to think about and to digest. I wrote down three comments that I'll go through really briefly. The first one is a very academic one, so I'm an academic who studies the administrative state, so forgive me for a moment. I noticed that the word deep state came up very often here, and I want to think about, so that's traditionally, historically, in the last few years, been a very pejorative term, but it came up in 2 ways. One, it came up as a deep well of expertise, right? The administrative state is this deep well of expertise and competence. The other way it came up as an unaccountable source of policymaking. I think both of these things are true, and it's a challenge for us to sort of highlight where we can draw our conversations to build on this insight that both of these things are true at the same time, and we want to think about what we mean when we say the deep state. Sorry, that was my academic point. The next thing I noted was that many of the comments focused on how appointees are not set up for leadership well. So Tom Donnellan mentioned that individuals are selected, not teams, and teams do better at leading is what I heard there. Elaine Kmark said, they don't have access to the White House. The people that need to get access need it, and they don't always have it in the way they need it to do their job well. Fran Townsend told us Schedule Cs are appointees are the ones who get things done. They're also the ones that don't have to be confirmed, because we also heard that delay in confirmation is a real problem for appointees. So what can we do as a group and structuring our conversation to make appointees be better leaders, right? We need them to fix the problems in the deep state. So how can we do that? The third point I'll make is just that foreign policy came up again and again as a really important way of marking a president's successes, but more often their failures. And so as we progress in our conversations, do we need to be divorcing the president's foreign policy prowess from his domestic policy prowess, which is something that scholars often do when they talk about the presidency. So we heard that the president has the authority he needs in the foreign policy arena, and that he's very, Tom Donnellan again told us he's able to get things done in this arena, right? That he has the competence he needs in that arena. We don't always think that in domestic policy making, right? And that's really where we might want to structure our conversation as we have all of these different points about expectations and failures around domestic versus foreign policy presidents.
So this is the exciting part of the graduate seminar. One might characterize as speed dating. I give members of the assembly here the opportunity to offer last comments, and the question would be particularly where do we agree? Where are the points of disagreement? What are the interesting questions around which scholars and centers such as the Miller Center could, devote more attention and time? Comments and closing thoughts to the hour.
We'll make an executive decision here to give 5 more minutes since we got a little bit of a late start. So let me go to 1:35.
The voice of God. Okay.
That's an example of benign despotism.
Eric Edelman, please.
As I listened to the comments from my fellow panelists, I listened particularly closely to Tom, because I sit next to him in the Defense Policy Board because we're alphabetically. And I agreed with much of what Tom said. There were 2 minor points that I disagreed with. One was on the treaty powers. I don't think New START actually is a good example, Tom, because it passed with the fewest votes of any arms control treaty since the era of arms control began in the Nixon administration, or arguably Kennedy with the limited test ban. But I doubt, frankly, that you can get any arms control treaty through the United States Senate again, at least as currently constituted. The second, I think from my experience, I have a slightly different view about the relationship between process and outcome in foreign policy. I have seen actually no real good correlation between successful process and successful outcomes. If you have a bad process, you have a much higher chance of getting a bad outcome. But I've seen some very good processes that came up short and had bad outcomes, and I've seen very bad processes that had a good outcome. I mean, and Philip, I defer to Philip because he's really kind of an expert on this. But if you read the transcripts of the XCOM of the NSC that Philip, and the late Ernest May edited, by any measure, it's a defective process. I mean, there's no agenda. People are talking over each other. There's, no record of conclusions from one piece. At one point, Robert Kennedy is going out of the room to literally cut and paste the response to Khrushchev that they're debating, and yet arguably the outcome was a good one, in part because the president in the face of almost unanimous opposition of all of his advisors, chose to pursue a certain course of action. So, I think the relationship between process and outcome is a very uneven one.
Elaine.
I just wanted to say something to Phil. I liked your division of fictive policy versus factual policy. And my point about the open nomination system is that campaigns are run almost exclusively, or are run exclusively on fictive policy. And the problem is that that comes into the White House, it's taken into the White House. The people who are adept at fictive policy are the people who have the president's ear and the president's trust, because he perceives them as the people who got him there. And that dominance within the White House creates a bias towards continual fictive policy versus factual policy. The removal of the White House operatives from the practicalities of implementation, I think, is worse and exacerbated by the way we choose our presidents and the way the people who become presidents learn about the world and learn about the job.
John?
Since I couldn't agree more, which means that I think one of the solutions, and perhaps everybody here can contribute to it, is trying to keep the presidential campaign centered on the factual policy rather than the fictive, not just to air the ideas of what the candidates have, which is important, and to educate the country, which is also important, but also to reduce the appetite for hiring people who are only good at fiction. And we know, of course, in the Gore-Bush 3 debates, the word terrorism came up only once and glancingly. Middle East policy probably hasn't been in the first two Republican debates. And the mismatch, I think, is not just that in my business, a lot of times people say, well, we got to talk more about issues. All of the talk about single-payer health care probably didn't tell us much in the Democratic primaries in 2020. I think issues are obviously quite important, but this question of execution, trying to shrink the mismatch between fictive and factual, and centering questions that all of you know how to ask much better than I do, that are related to what the job actually is, might be one way to kind of shrink a little bit. I realize it's in the environment that's the current media environment, which is madness, but trying to center these questions for the next campaign on what the job is, and it's try to keep it there rather than in the world of fiction.
Katie?
So this goes back to Rachel and Sid, and you focus on partisanship and polarization as primary reasons, and the trends in both of those as the primary reasons for failures, so to speak. And it strikes me that maybe one question we should be asking are, what are some small bore solutions where we can sort of work towards trying to remedy some of the problems that these produce? Because I think that in many respects, an average person might think these are just insoluble. Like, you have partisanship, how do you reverse it? You have polarization in both institutions, how do you reverse that? And that seems like such a Mount Everest that I think we need to think, and maybe break it down into categories: presidential appointees, foreign policy, different aspects, in order to really be able to hone in on ways in which we can reverse the negative effects associated with increased partisanship and polarization.
Can I respond? Sid, quickly. First, I very much appreciate the question. First, I want to quickly respond to my friend Philip, who we seem to have provoked. And I want to plead, and I'll get to your, I want to plead not guilty to your soft impeachment that we focus too much on Trump. In an academic sense, a better test of our theory is Joe Biden, the last politician, right? There was a book written about him, a pragmatic politician who promised to be the ballast against the progressive wing of his party, but has been pulled into pretty deep partisanship. That's why his numbers are underwater. He's got 5% support from Republicans, and he's not just a victim. If you listen to his rhetoric, it's been very polarizing at times. Not all MAGA people are authoritarians. I have two brother-in-laws who are MAGA people, and I don't like them very much, but they're not authoritarian. They think the system's rigged against them, but they're not authoritarian. Also, Biden, although he resisted it, eventually gave in to the demands of the progressive wing of the party that he pushed aggressively to relieve a large part of the population to student debt, provide relief for student debt. So I think, and this goes to your point, Katie, that to get at the problem, you can't just look at the presidency. I don't think the problem is just top-down. I think it's a top-down, bottom-up kind of process going on. And we have to look beyond the presidency, not just to places like Congress and the courts, but to social movements and advocacy groups that have become very important in American politics. The Office of Public Engagement, or I think Nixon called it the Office of Liaison Policy, or what was it called? The Office of Public Liaison, that's right. That's become a really important office. And when Tim gave his great interview a couple of weeks ago, he talked about the importance not only of Trump, but of the social movements, the right-wing social movements that were the foot soldiers of January 6th. And we can't understand what's going on in terms of the MAGA movement unless we look at groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, I believe. So I think if we're going to take on the problem, we can't just focus on the presidency, although I think there are structural things we can address regarding the presidency. But we have a systemic development here that combines executive prerogative and social activism, and that relationship has become very tight as a result of the two developments that Rachel and I talk about in our memo.
Tom Donilon, 1 minute.
Okay. One, Eric, on process. Dwight Eisenhower said it best, which is that a good process won't guarantee a good outcome, but a bad process will really make it less likely that you're going to get a good outcome. And that's been my personal experience, and we can go through them. Every time I've run a good process, I've had a much better chance of getting a good outcome, number one. Number two, one thing we haven't talked about, Bob, is the effect of social media in this brew. And it is a critical part of the trends, I think, which is it does kind of play to the extremes. It allows extremists who normally wouldn't be able to find each other in the process to find each other and to activate themselves. And we're now heading into an even more difficult time, I think, where truth is going to be incredibly more difficult to find. And I think that's a challenge, I think, for a president, for our political system. The deep state, it's become a term in vogue, right? During the course of the Trump presidency. I came into office. The last time I came in was in 2009. And we wanted to undertake a substantial shift in policy from the Bush administration. We were fully informed when we came in about it. We had a terrific transition, I think a model transition that Josh helped run. But we had a very different view. I never really felt, there were people who disagreed with us. I never really felt as National Security Advisor that I had opposition in the government, right? There were people and experts that you had to deal with who had different views, but I regarded, frankly, the professional intelligence, military, and security services as being quite responsive to the direction of the president, frankly. So I do think, Philip's point, President Trump was a different kind of president, brought different kinds of challenges, I think, but I never really felt a kind of some active resistance or undermining the president, even though we had deep disagreements about changes in policies when we came in. Last thing I'll say is that I do think that, again, and Josh kind of references at the top, in the current environment, a strong presidency is pretty essential if you're going to take on societal and governmental policy challenges. And that's kind of the perspective that you have if you work in the executive branch. Obviously, as Mark said, you want sustainability, right, in your policy. You'd like to have as broad support as possible, so working with Congress makes a difference. And as I said, I think it is possible to work. Eric, you pointed about arms control. There will be specific policy issues on which the parties have kind of separated themselves. But in general, I don't think it's impossible. I think President Biden kind of showed that as well during the course of his undertaking, a number of important industrial policy initiatives, essentially. So, some of the stuff we talked about today wasn't my experience kind of in the government. I think it was a result of some special circumstances that we've had. Although the question is at the beginning is whether or not these trends will bring us more of that's the million-dollar question, right? You know, because they've been building up over a long time, and I did want to underscore the importance of social media.
And I'll close with one observation. Oh, Josh, go ahead. We have a dispensation from the Almighty.
All right. Just a quick comment and question for the group. First, I think Tom is spot on with a lot of elements, and Rachel, your suggestion that we divide the national security from the rest of the president's agenda is probably a wise one. But Bob, can I pose the question for this group as we go through the rest of this conference, and ask and first begin with the postulate that that we agree that the administrative state has become so substantial as to be something of a danger in our society. I think Sid and Rachel expressed that very clearly, but that the problem we're really trying to get at with specifically the presidency, because the problems in our governance are so broad and multifaceted, but that the problem in the presidency is how do we incent the president to govern from the center, which is what produces sustainable policy and some measure of social cohesion. And that my suggestion to the group and a question is, can we agree that that is one of the central things we are trying to help accomplish, and maybe spend some of the rest of our focus on figuring out what can be done institutionally to incent the president to govern from the center. I don't think the leaders in governance today, with some notable exceptions, are worse than they ever have been, but the incentives for them are very bad.
I'll add a closing comment, which is in fact an appetizer for the forthcoming sessions, and is, in my view, an issue lurking in our discussion has been the authorities granted to the president and or not granted, but perhaps assumed. Tomorrow morning we'll talk about the capital C Constitution and the small c Constitution, a set of norms and practices that presidents have appropriated. This is, of course, an issue that originalists such as our colleague Sai Prakash from UVA Law School's very, very good book raises, and which will be featured in one or more of the sessions to follow. We have time for a 15-minute break. I'm cautioned by the staff here. We must not run over. Everyone, if you would join me in thanking our panelists.